Oh, hooray. Good. Alright. Oh, hooray. Okay. So today's presentation is going to be about how to tackle the quantitative section. Hello everyone, again. My name is Taryn, like Karen with the T, and I will be your presenter for today's webinar on tackling the GRE quantitative section. We may have already met in last week's webinar, but I have been working as a test prep tutor at Magoosh for about 10 months now. A little bit about me. I was born and raised in Southern California, and I currently live in San Diego. I have a bachelor's degree in developmental psychology from UCSD, and I want to study biology in grad school. I love math, science, writing, and music, and my favorite quarantine snack is sour gummies. So for today's agenda, we'll start with some housekeeping. We will talk about how to study GRE Math. We'll give some GRE Math tips. We'll talk about some important GRE Math concepts, and then we'll end with a Q&A. We'll send the recording and any additional resources after in an email. If we don't already have your email address, you can register in the link below in the YouTube description. And we'll have a Q&A at the end to answer any dire questions. If we don't get to your question today, you can email us at any time at help@magoosh.com. When many students begin to try tackling the quantitative section, they often just buy a few of the major test prep books and plan to study each book page by page, hoping that this will be sufficient to master GRE Math. However, studying for GRE Quant is actually much more complicated than that. Indeed, many students soon become frustrated by such an approach, feeling that after hundreds of pages and tens of hours they have learned very little. To avoid such a thing befalling you, there are some things you will need to know about how to study for the GRE quantitative section, and how not to. First, it's important to not rely on formulas. Doing so can actually cause more harm than good, because formulas are only so helpful. They certainly are not nearly as essential as developing your problem-solving skills. Many students feel that all they have to do is use the formulas and they can solve a question. In actuality, you must first decipher what the question is asking. Only at the very end, once you know how the different parts come together, can you set up the question. But if you find yourself stuck in a problem with only a formula or two in hand, remember that the essence of problem solving is just that, solving the problem using logic so you can use the formula when appropriate. Many students learn some basic concepts and formulas and feel like they have mastered GRE Math. However, as soon as they attempt to complete a random set of questions, they break down, not knowing exactly what kind of problem they are dealing with. Basic problems like those found in Manhattan GRE Math books are a great way to start studying. You can build on the basics in one chapter and solve problems of easy to medium difficulty. This phase, however, is just the beginning. In reality, successfully answering a medley of questions depends on doing GRE Math practice sessions that take you out of your comfort zone. In other words, you should try some randomly chosen questions. Opening the official GRE guide and trying the first math question you see is a good start. Even if you have not seen the concept, you get the opportunity to familiarize yourself with the question with limited information. It may seem scary to attempt problems that require skills you have not yet developed, but the reality is that students can solve many problems based on what they already know. However, because of the way GRE questions are structured, many familiar concepts are disguised, and problems will seem much more intimidating than they actually are. Succeeding at the GRE Math section requires you to be able to answer a wide, diverse array of questions. The best way to study when you are starting out is to repeatedly try some randomly chosen questions. This will help you to move past the basic concepts and formulas and enable you to confidently tackle the quantitative section on test day. When you are studying, you should focus on deciphering what the question is asking on a conceptual level and making the appropriate plan to solve the problem. This skill is more valuable than any formula. If you do a set amount of mixed practice problems each day while making your way through all of the concepts, that should be more effective than going through several GRE prep books page by page. Also, if some of the fundamental concepts continually stump you, it may be a good idea to seek out worksheets online that focus on that specific topic. Khan Academy is extremely useful for this purpose. Additionally, Magoosh Premium allows access to all of our lesson videos, which are organized by topic. Alright. Let me see if there are any questions about this section. Alright. So far, so good. We'll move on to some GRE math tips then. If you are a beginner in GRE math, performing well in the quantitative section may seem insurmountable. However, even if you think you are bad or too rusty in math, you can still do well. The best way to improve your GRE scores is to practice extensively. Overcome your knowledge gaps by testing many different types of problems and working on comprehensive practice tests. Use test preparation websites, like Magoosh, where you can study and solve solutions carefully. That way you can better understand what your strengths and weaknesses are. Perhaps the biggest challenge that beginners in mathematics face is managing test anxiety. Sometimes the mere thought of taking an important test can be overwhelming, especially if math has never been your strong point and/or if it has been years since you took it. Timed tests with high-risk results like the GRE Math section can exacerbate any math anxiety you've already had. To ease some of your worries, you need to adopt a growth mindset. A growth mindset is the idea that you can always increase your knowledge and skills by practicing and reviewing. Many students are trapped in a fixed mindset where they delude themselves into believing that they are terrible at math and cannot improve beyond a certain threshold, or that they naturally are just not math people. If you have this fixed mindset, you'll be stressed by trying to achieve what seems impossible, although with enough practice you can solve questions that you couldn't before. Advanced students have a separate set of struggles to overcome. It's not just math skill and content knowledge that separates the highest scores from the average scorers. High-achieving students also know how to navigate carefully and accurately through the GRE quantitative section. An important habit to develop is to always check your work. When a problem ends, you shouldn't just select the answer and move on, because you may fall into one of the GRE's many traps. You should try to make sure your answer makes sense in the problem. If you can, plug your answer into the problem to verify it. If the answer can be found differently, Try double checking that way if you have enough time. When you go too fast, you may find yourself making silly mistakes. When studying, it's always better to achieve accuracy before speed. Only once you master the integrated GRE math concepts can you be truly efficient on test day. The GRE is unique in that it is administered entirely online, and you are only allowed to use the provided computer calculator. An important tip for all GRE students: don't jump right to the calculator for every problem. For one thing, the online calculator is a bit wonky and cumbersome to use if you are used to working with a physical calculator. Instead, make good use of your scrap paper. Second, it will be much better to use your time to think about the concepts within the problems rather than the calculations involved. Oftentimes, problems are set up to make calculations easy, but if you miss the embedded shortcuts, you could waste time pressing buttons unnecessarily. In general, you should avoid using the calculator unless you are solving large multiplications or divisions, etc. Managing your time well is crucial for any standardized test, but especially for the GRE. Pacing yourself is key on the GRE Math section. According to ETS, each quantitative reasoning section contains 20 questions to be done in 35 minutes. That means that on average you will have 1 minute and 45 seconds per problem. So if you don't yet have a plan for how to solve the problem within 15 seconds after first reading it, you should probably skip it until later. And if you find yourself taking more than 2 minutes on a given problem, you should consider moving on. Additionally, it's often a better idea to skip the multiple select problems until later as well, because they tend to take longer and are much higher risk. The online test has a way for you to mark questions for later review, and you should take full advantage of this. Another important thing to note: the quantitative reasoning sections are also adaptive. The difficulty of the second set of questions depends on how well you did on the first set. So be very careful with the first set of questions. And don't be discouraged if you start seeing really hard problems on the second set, because that means you've already done pretty well on the first set. People who believe themselves to be bad at math can still be successful on the GRE Math section. The first thing to realize is that you aren't bad, you just have not gotten good yet. People who are good at math have just had a lot of good quality practice. If you keep practicing and embrace the idea that you can always increase your knowledge and skills, you will make great progress. On the other hand, people who tend to excel in math often work too quickly and carelessly, and they find themselves making silly mistakes. Remember that it's more important to get the problem correct than it is to finish it quickly. Another thing to remember is that mental math always trumps the online calculator. The GRE math questions are designed to require minimally complicated calculations, so you should avoid using the calculator unless you have done as much simplification as possible. In order to pace yourself through the test, you should initially skip any problems that are too difficult for you or would take long to do, marking them for later review. Finally, the GRE quantitative reasoning sections are adaptive, so the difficulty of the second set of questions depends on how you did on the first set. So we have a question. What if a person belongs to a non-math background? So if you are mostly unfamiliar with math overall, then it might be a good idea to start at the very beginning, start at the basics. Take what you do know and build off of that. If, for example, you know that fractions are just like speaking another language to you, then you should really double down on learning how to do fractions and then move on from there. Alright. Now we'll talk about important GRE math concepts. While you are studying GRE math, it's vital to monitor your progress. If you have made it far enough into your study routine that you have done around 250 mixed practice problems, then you can start to assess how well you are doing in each topic. You can sort your practice problems into 12 categories: word problems, percents and ratios, algebra, data interpretation, arithmetic and fractions, integer properties, geometry, statistics, powers and roots, counting, probability, and coordinate plane. Determine what percentage of each topic you are getting correct. If you have a Magoosh account, all of this information will be available to you under the Review tab. You can go to your account, click Review, you can filter by which subject you're interested in, say powers and roots. And see what percentage of these questions you've gotten correct. And you can do that for every topic. Your practice questions correct. If you are above 70% accuracy in every one of the aforementioned topics, then you should focus on your bottom 3 topics. These are your current struggles. Are you struggling with word problems, percents and ratios, or algebra? If so, then it is probably a good idea to make these topics your primary focus. Not your sole focus, but your primary focus, at least until you are solid in them. Word problems overlap with many concepts. They are really pervasive on the test and deal with math from many different angles. There are statistics word problems, arithmetic word problems, geometry word problems, and so much more. Word problems are in fact the most common GRE math problems. Mathematical reading comprehension is a crucial skill overall. The ability to properly interpret story problems, charts, and tables has clear importance on the GRE. Algebra is another concept that overlaps massively with others. You may encounter an algebra component in problems that deal with any other concept. Percents and ratios are also ubiquitous throughout the test. Mastering these topics will give you a solid foundation upon which to build the rest of your math studies. Now, let's say that you are strong in word problems, percents, and ratios, and algebra. What then? The next topics you should tackle are data interpretation, arithmetic and fractions, integer properties, geometry, and statistics. Data interpretation problems require you to use your reading comprehension skills to interpret the math in charts and tables. Arithmetic and integer properties require you to understand the properties of numbers and how to use them. Geometry requires you to know the properties of shapes, lines, and angles. And statistics requires you to know how to calculate the mean and median of a set of numbers. All of these skills will help to fill out your mathematical resume effectively and you're going to want to attend to them if you are struggling with them. Finally, if you are going for a top score, then powers and roots, counting, probability, and coordinate plane problems should be your last goal to take on before the test. Powers and roots problems often feature complex expressions and equations with exponents and radicals. Counting and probability problems predominantly feature combinatorics and probability rules. Coordinate plane problems deal with geometric relationships between lines and shapes in the xy plane. If you are not struggling with any of the previously listed topics, then it may be worth your while to spend time studying these topics. All of the topics mentioned previously overlap with the 4 format types of GRE Math questions on the official exam: quantitative comparisons, multiple choice, multiple select, and numeric entry. In quantitative comparison questions, you'll see 2 columns, A and B. Each one contains a value, which can be a formula, an expression, or an actual number. You have to determine the relationship between them, if one is greater, if they're the same, or if it can't be determined from the information provided. With multiple choice questions, you'll see a problem and 5 answer choices. With multiple select problems, there are up to 8 answer choices for the problem, and 1 or more of the answers may be correct. Your job is to select any and all that are correct, and unfortunately, there isn't any partial credit. With numeric entry questions, you'll come up with your own answer, no choices are provided, and type it into a box. Along with the mathematical skills you will have picked up while studying, there are distinct strategies for each question format that you will have to practice. This may all seem daunting, but it is possible if you pace yourself and break your studying up into smaller, more manageable goals. Studying for the GRE quantitative section is like building a pyramid. You have to start at the base and build your way up. The base level of the pyramid comprises word problems, percents and ratios, or algebra. The middle layer comprises data interpretation, arithmetic and fractions, integer properties, geometry, and statistics. The top of your pyramid consists of powers and roots, counting and probability, and coordinate plane. In order for your pyramid to be sturdy, you have to ensure that each level is stable before moving on. If you are struggling to understand a concept, start off with easy problems and work your way up to higher difficulty problems. Examine the mistakes you are making and try to understand why you are making them. Doing so will help improve your understanding and prevent you from making those mistakes in the future. Okay, so we have some questions. Which type of math question is most commonly missed, if any? The type of math questions that are most commonly missed are probably combinatorics and probability. Those are some really advanced, high-level, abstract concepts that most students struggle with, and thankfully they don't appear on the test very often. Combined, they have about a 6% frequency. Okay. Can you share some tips to tackle harder data interpretation problems that involve finding medians or percent changes for consecutive bar graphs? Alright, so for finding medians in bar graphs or histograms, you have to first either locate or determine how many values there are. For example, if you are taking a histogram of students at a school, you want to know how many students there are. And then once you have that number, you have to divide that in half. Medians always split the set in two groups, two even groups. Once you decide what 1/2 of the total is, start subtracting each bar, going from left to right until you have absorbed the first half of the students. And that's how you'll find your median. Okay, and percent changes. Well, percent change is the new value minus the original value divided by the original value. Sometimes they will tell you exactly which values they're looking for. Other times you have to look into the graph. But the GRE quantitative data interpretation graphs are usually well labeled. You just have to keep track of which is your new value and which is your original. So thank you for attending our webinar on tackling the GRE quantitative reasoning section. I hope it was helpful. Just a reminder, we'll send the recording and any additional resources after in an email. Please let us know if you think any information is missing. And now I would like to open the floor up for Q&A once everyone's ready. What type of quant question is the most common? So that would definitely be word problems. Word problems make up about 36% of the test. However, you could also say that algebra, since pretty much most of the word problems and a lot of other types of problems also involve algebra, those are also very important. Other questions? Okay. Is it a smart idea to skip the multiple answer questions and come back later? Yes. The multiple answer questions. So there can be up to 8 answer choices, and you have to select every one that is correct, and you can't select any that are incorrect. There's no partial credit, so it's very hard to get it all right, and it's worth the same amount of points as any other questions. How long should I spend studying each section? Well, you want to spend the first few weeks, however long it takes you to accumulate 250 practice problems, just studying mixed practice while you're doing your concept lessons. For those of us who are weak in math and English, what is the best way? Okay, so word problems require you to be able to turn English syntax into math syntax. So if you're already struggling with English syntax, it's going to be a great challenge. I would say get good at recognizing certain terms and how to turn those into math. For example, if you see the word of, for example, 2/3 of something, that's going to be a multiplication. If you see the word per, like miles per hour, you're going to be dividing the amount of miles by the amount of hours. If you see any conjugation of the word to be, like this person is, this person was, this person will be, that's your equal sign. Okay. When can I know where to put negative positive signs with roots? Okay, so if there is a root presented in the GRE question, that's always the positive root. However, if somewhere along your calculations you have to put in a square root, you have to consider both the positive and the negative square root. Next question, how does doing well on the first section and then poorly on a more advanced section affect your score versus scoring relatively well on medium level sections? Well, the first section will be roughly medium on average. There may be some easier questions, some harder questions, but overall it'll be a mostly medium difficulty section. If you do well on it, then you'll get the harder questions, and if you do poorly on it, then you'll get the easier sections. If you do well on the medium level section and then not as well on the advanced, you can still get a decent score because you've gotten most of the first 20 and you're going to get some of the next 20. Are there any other resources besides questions from Magoosh, Manhattan 5 pounds, and ETS official guides? Please share some advanced sources for practicing. That's a good question. So Magoosh and Manhattan are probably the best. I may be a little bit biased. But you can also try Kaplan, not Kaplan, Khan Academy, or Princeton. There are a lot of different GRE test prep sites that you can use. Other questions? I have a problem with the counting section and probability sections. Do you have any recommendations? Okay. So, with counting and probability, well, first let's talk about counting. The first thing to do with counting is think about exactly what they're asking and whether order matters or doesn't matter. One example is the difference between selecting a group of 3 athletes from 10 to go on to the next round versus selecting a gold medalist, a silver medalist, and a bronze medalist from 10 athletes. In the former situation, order wouldn't matter because you're just selecting a group of 3 from the 10. If you are selecting the different levels, then order does matter. Because if you are gold, you can't be silver or bronze. And there's a lot of overlap between counting and probability. Remember that probability is the number of ways you can get what you want, whatever you're trying to look for with the probability, divided by the number of possibilities. A simple example, if you have a bag with 50 marbles in it, and 10 of them are red, the probability of selecting a red marble would be 1 in 5. Okay. Next question. Solving Manhattan 5 pound, will it be sufficient to cover all concepts of quant? So it will be sufficient to talk about all of the concepts and get to your basic level of practice, but in order to have integrated practice and combine what you're doing into a more complex, more GRE-like way, you might consider other things like Magoosh, for example. How to improve my calculation speed. I think you're referring to mental math. If you're trying to do some calculations in your head, it's best to break the numbers into smaller parts. For example, if you're trying to multiply 24 times 9, you'd want to multiply 9 by 20 and 9 by 4, and then add those two together. Okay, next question. What about solving GMAT questions for practicing harder questions? Because these are a bit harder than the GRE. So if you're trying to substitute GMAT questions for GRE questions, there is a lot of overlap, but the structure is somewhat different. For example, the GRE has the quantitative comparisons that we discussed earlier, whereas the GMAT has data sufficiency. But they overlap in their problem-solving questions. Those are very similar. Other questions? All right, I'll end it here then. Thank you for coming.